AML and CFT, the counter-financing of terrorism. That phrase is often used as in a different acronym, but in the US I think that's the one that you use. So criminalisation, customer due diligence, reporting of suspicious transactions, law enforcement responsibilities and international cooperation. They remain bedrock of what we need to do in terms of terrorism financing as well as money laundering, and we will be improving the way in which we look at their actual operational effectiveness in the future. In terms of specifically CFT, we're now looking at more financial sanctions related to terrorism, greater transparency of wire transfers, more concentration on cash couriers, and more controls on non-profit organisations. I should say, while I remember it, that in terms of sanctions, the word generally means many things, but the FATF does have another means in which pressure is brought to bear on countries, which some people refer to as our sanctions mechanism. We call it countermeasures, and that is a group that looks at non-cooperative countries, as we often call them. That's the International Cooperation Review Group, and we have on our website, and it's publicly displayed often at every plenary, we reconsider countries that are on our list. We have a grey list and we have a black list. We've just revised that if you want to look at it. I won't go into any details of it now, but the effect of that public listing process and the effect of some of the measures that members of the FATF take as a consequence of countries going into the black part of the list is having a very galvanizing effect on responses to at least the technical compliance levels of the FATF standards. We're going to maintain that group and maintain that pressure for those countries that either are unwilling to cooperate or engage with the FATF or who are doing it too slowly. Structural integration, we've mentioned this before, so I'll be very quick about this. I think the FATF made the right decision in integrating the special recommendations. You heard of some of the synergies today that come from that already. I think most of the typologies examples we've had over the years don't show a great deal of distinction between the mechanisms for money laundering and mechanisms for terrorist financing. So I think we've been able to now, with less difficulty than I had anticipated, to integrate the Special 9 recommendations on terrorism financing and the previously existing 40 recommendations. But for the future, there'll be more focus on risk, as I've already mentioned, and hopefully we'll have an ability to have more tailored situations. What I mean by that is some countries who do play the game properly in terms of undertaking an assessment and getting some technically bad results are not necessarily happy about the fact that they get lower scores than some countries who have high technical results, but in some of those other cases, those technical results are as a consequence of a paper exercise of systems being put in place as opposed to actual operational effectiveness. So we have to listen to that because there's an element of truth to that, and we have to build that into the next round of evaluations. And that by its nature, I hope, will bring us to a more collaborative and more realistic outcome of the evaluation processes. These are truisms. Greater transparency means better ability to trace the terrorist funds. We will in the future have some broader scopes than we had previously. We mentioned tax information here because 2 weeks ago when the new standards were approved, tax offences, at least tax crimes, were included for the first time as predicate offences for money laundering. That has proved to be a bridge too far until now. Many countries did not want that to happen for various reasons. Some countries didn't consider avoidance of tax or even evasion of tax to be a crime at all. It was an administrative misdemeanor of some kind. 1 or 2 countries still think that, but the vast majority of FATF and now the rules of the FATF will allow us to take those types of crimes into account. And as a consequence, and as perhaps a corollary of that, the type of cooperation that will be available to law enforcement agencies in association with national tax administrations will improve, and therefore also will the exchange of information within the law that will be able to come from that. I can say from my own previous experience, when I was an investigator once, the capacity, this won't happen in every country of course, but the capacity to access taxation information was a gold mine for law enforcement agencies. I don't mean in the sense of generating unnecessary or burdensome investigations of individuals' tax affairs for the sake of it, but rather to allow a trigger for the actual transactions of money involving people who were both avoiding tax on a large scale, but were also generating proceeds of crime and avoiding tax at the same time. So we have that crossover. We'll have more investigative tools as a consequence. When I say we, I need to re-emphasize that the FATF is only a task force. It's not an international body. It has no powers of its own. It's in that sense a very peculiar creature, because although it has no legal powers and it has no international instruments that can be mandated by itself, it has far more power than many other bodies that are so mandated. And that comes from two things: that the national governments who support the FATF and are part of it will actually take strong measures as a consequence of their reaching agreement in consensus in the FATF. It also means something in terms of commercial reality, because, well, I think most of my colleagues from the financial institution, two are still here, might hopefully agree with me that the bad publicity that might result from dealing wittingly or unwittingly with criminals or terrorist financiers puts a much greater stringency on the way in which financial institutions deal with this problem. And that's a pressure on its own. In fact, sometimes it has reached situations where some small countries, I won't name, but I do have some names, one or two, which were, by dint of the risk that the financial institutions working in those countries where they were offering services actually closed down operations entirely, simply because the risk wasn't worth it, even though there was no perceived actual criminality going on. They just said, can't take that risk, we're out of here. So that's the kind of effect that actually can and does happen as a consequence of these measures being available to national governments. With better international cooperation, especially information exchange, this will not just be an improvement, I think, in the normal exchange of information using tools that have existed for a long time, such as mutual legal assistance treaty exchanges and evidentiary exchanges between courts and spontaneous exchanges of information from police to police, but it will also mean greater exchanges of information by supervisory authorities than has happened in the past, and greater application of group rules, for instance by multinational financial institutions who have a high standard of performance and information exchange in their headquarters area. How do they handle that in relation to their subsidiary operations in other countries? Hopefully, the way the new recommendations have been revised, there's more emphasis on making that work better. So, getting down to the end of the day, I'll try and keep this a little bit shorter now. Going to the bottom slide, the bottom bullet point there, countries do have to deal with some big challenges. There are different features of terrorist financing relative to money laundering, despite what I said before. There are some. There's limited awareness of terrorist financing risks in many countries. There's a denial in some countries for various reasons that this is a problem that needs a rectification at all. The scope of an effective system is not well understood in many places, so there's both an education required in many places, and there's a capacity constraint that will need to be assisted in many places around the world. That's why we have, for instance, in the FATF regional bodies, technical assistance and training exercises and initiatives on the go, so that they will be able to, and these are very widespread technical assistance and training, capacity building operations, in Africa, Asia, and South America and other places, in order to build the types of structures that already exist in many other places but cannot exist and operate effectively in those places because they simply either do not have the current capacity financially or in terms of expertise. So that needs to be built, and there is a mechanisms for trying to do that now. And we discussed at great length just before using financial intelligence effectively, so I'm not going to repeat any of that. Some of the issues in relation to specific terrorist financing as opposed to money laundering are listed here in simple terms. I'm sure that my colleagues here can do it better than I in terms of more reasoned arguments, but for the sake of simplicity, and again, I'm just a lawyer, compared to money laundering, terrorist financing is very different and harder to detect by law enforcement agencies and not just by financial institutions. There's one aspect which we didn't discuss today but which is extremely important, and that is the interplay between espionage agencies. I use that term in that sense because we've been talking about financial intelligence units and intelligence loosely, but those agencies which are actually intelligence agencies who have a very significant role to play in relation to deterring the risks and the actual carrying out of terrorist attacks. They obviously need as much information about this topic as they can get. The financial structures and financial information that can be generated by these rules and standards, particularly through the financial intelligence units, but not just by them, is now at a level of operational interaction greater than it ever has been before, necessarily so, and that is improving. Naturally, in that arena, it is generally a one-way street of information, as it should be. But that's fine, because it leads to, hopefully, a good outcome, and that is deterrence or detection. So there's going to be a greater concentration. I think there needs to be, and I think Richard Barrett, you were alluding to this a little bit earlier in your presentation this morning. That's a highly significant improvement I think we need to have in terms of sharing of information there, because those two worlds have been, for many, many decades, two different worlds, the law enforcement one and the espionage one. They're no longer two different worlds in the sense of the combating of this problem, and that I feel is getting better by the day in terms of information availability. I'll skip that one. We did talk about indicators a lot. This is a slide. Some of these, of course, you can take home and read or discard, but just for the sake of completeness, these are some of the things that we need to consider as we go forward. And making better use of financial intelligence units, as we discussed just now. So I think I will leave it at that. That's 15 minutes. That's only half the time that I was allocated, but I hope you'll give me credit for not taking you longer than that, including those of you who are getting 4 hours of CLE credit for this course. I want 2 hours of it for myself. So it's been a pleasure to be able to talk to you. I hope that you take something away from this. I'm sure that you should, from the input of the private sector, which I'm mightily impressed by today. And we will be with the private sector, not just with the colleagues who are in this room, but with their institutions, be taking forward a better way of determining at least the typologies work that was discussed today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, one and all, for coming, and thank you, Bob, for being head of the Institute and wanting to bring this here for discussion here on Friday, and to all the visitors from around the world and just from Akron. Thanks very much, and the meeting is adjourned.